This is part 2 of my series on the Korean War. Let's dive right back in. We left off last time with the UN forces in control of much of North Korea and steadily pushing towards the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. The Chinese, after having multiple warnings ignored, sent the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, south across the border. These two giant forces crashed into each other during the winter of 1950. These first contacts did not go well for the UN forces. 8th Army, under General Walton Walker, was very quickly routed and running back south, while the situation in the east with 10th Corps, under Edmund Almond, was much more difficult. The 1st Division of the US Marines was holding the Chosin Reservoir when they were hit by a massive force of PLA soldiers. For 17 days, these two forces battled it out in freezing conditions high in the mountains. This brutal battle came to an end as the Marines successfully fought their way through to friendly forces, along with some army units and a force of Royal Marines sent to assist them. Despite heroics like this, the UN forces were in a bad position. Caught off guard, despite the warnings of plenty of people that China would attack, especially the Chinese, the Allied forces were saved by the fact that they had trucks and the PLA did not. 10th Corps successfully retreated out to sea and would later re-land further south. 8th Army pulled back, and because the Chinese were unable to pursue effectively, a new defensive line was able to be established. Despite this successful retreat, the opening round of battles between the UN and Chinese forces had been a clear victory for China. With Pyongyang liberated and the KPA now reforming, the Communist forces prepared to drive south once again. The Yankees were a bit put out by this, to say the very least. General MacArthur had loudly argued against the possibility of Chinese involvement, and when it was proven that they had come south, he massively underestimated the size of the enemy force. When the full disaster that was occurring became clear to him, he began to bang the drum for nuclear weapons to be used, to turn the Yalu border region into a wasteland that no reinforcements or supplies could cross. Thankfully, this was not done. Other voices suggested the UN forces pull all the way back to Pusan or off the peninsula altogether. One person not advising this was the new commander of 8th Army, General Ridgway. He took command after the tragic death of Walker in a car crash. Ridgway was the right man for the very difficult job in front of him. Tough, gruff, and no nonsense. He expected much from those under him, and much more from himself. There are stories of him ripping up plans of retreats and joining the grunts on patrol. He quickly restored order and discipline to the shaken UN forces. After surveying the scene, however, he quickly realised 8th Army was in a bad position. Despite holding off the initial assaults, he soon gave the order to pull back. This was no rout though, much more of a fighting retreat. Seoul was abandoned and occupied by the PLA, a great propaganda victory for the Communists, but one with very little strategic value. Logistics were a massive problem for the Communist forces. The US Air Forces had almost complete air superiority, and so all supplies had to move during the night, and much of it by human porters. This made rapid advance nearly impossible, and meant those soldiers at the front were often cold and hungry. The UN, meanwhile, was a completely motorised force, and so were usually much better supplied and able to manoeuvre much more quickly. With these advantages, the UN forces were first able to stabilise the front line and began pushing the Communist forces back. They recaptured Seoul, the 4th time it had changed hands this war. The front line eventually settled around the 38th parallel line. It was now July of 1951, and with the war entering a stalemate, peace talks began to be held. These talks would continue for the next 2 years, while two opposing armies faced each other in trenches often less than a mile apart. finally, on July 27th, an agreement was reached, where Korea would remain divided between North and South. 3 million people had died over the course of just over 3 years for a return to the status quo. A bloody draw that left no side able to claim a clear victory. This is why, in my opinion, Korea is often called the Forgotten War in the West. No heroic victory against evil like World War II, no bloody failure like Vietnam, just an inconclusive draw that continues to the present day, as neither North or South Korea has recognised the peace, and both sides still lay claim to the whole peninsula. And with South Korea's Prime Minister being impeached because he tried to bring in martial law against his parliament, which he accused of being too pro-North Korean, and with North Korea sending artillery shells and now troops to fight in Ukraine in return for Russian military assistance, there is every chance of this war going hot before it goes ultimately cold. And now that I've said all that out loud, what the fuck is going on, man? Anyway, this is History 101, and I will see you in the next one.